James, thanks for coming on. Really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Sure. Um, I am a trained attorney. For 18 years, I was a public prosecutor in San Diego County, where I prosecuted murder and rape cases. I have a Juris Doctorate. I've taught law. So my background is in forensics and law. I was a criminal attorney for many years. But for the last 35 to 40 years, I've also dedicated myself to something else, the study of the origins of Christianity. And it is my current book that we're talking about, Creating Christ, How Roman Emperors Invented Christianity, is the product of 35 years of intensive research between me and my co-author. So it's more like 60 or 70 years of collective research on the project. But that's basically me. I'm happily married, live in San Diego, and love life.
Myself, muted myself, and too tired. So tell me more about your position on, did Romans create Jesus? Why do you think that happened? Why don't you think he was a real person? Um,
Well, I
do
think
you think it was a combination?
I think Jesus may have been a real person. The title may be slightly misleading. It's not creating Jesus, it's creating Christ. You see, the divine God man. There's little question that the upshot of modern scholarship is that the Gospels, the New Testament documents as we have them, are highly mythologized, unhistorical. Since the 1800s and the intensive work of brilliant German scholars who were reading very carefully the texts of the New Testament for the first time, they realized that, of course, they have very little to do with history. They're really recycled versions of Hebrew scripture, influenced by pagan mystery cults, as we now understand. So the historicity of the New Testament is really not an issue anymore. We
What
realize
you mean, like all of the dead didn't rise as soon as Jesus died? This wasn't a historical fact?
no, but that doesn't settle the issue, which I think is a relatively unimportant issue, although scholars give it a great deal of issue, the historicity versus mythicism debate. To me, it doesn't much matter whether there was a historical Jesus, because the figure of the Gospels is the one who had the great influence on history. It's that Jesus. And the Jesus of the New Testament is, of course, a highly mythologized being who rose from the dead, performed miracles, said things that scholars know couldn't have possibly said, but have been said by a living Jesus. So there's a big difference between understanding that the New Testament presents a mythologized, recreated character, this Christ Jesus, and that's the character who was created, in effect, by New Testament Christianity.
You said couldn't have been said by the living Jesus. What do you mean by that?
Oh, most scholars, in fact, very, very famously, the Jesus Seminar a few decades ago did an analysis of all the sayings of Jesus found in the Gospels. And their conclusion was a good 85% or more of those things which are quoted from Jesus simply could not have likely been said by any living Jesus. Let's start with one of my favorites. Pick up your own cross and follow me, Jesus famously says. Now, before his crucifixion, now, let's assume Jesus could even miraculously predict the form of his own execution. Would his listeners have been able to understand that? Moreover, Jesus is talking about crucifixion in a symbolic way. Pick up your own cross, T-Jump, whatever that happens to be. So he's talking about it metaphorically and symbolically. That it suggests to me something said way after the crucifixion, or and put into the mouth of Jesus at much later time. And most scholars agree. Another good example are all of the Torah critical things that Jesus says. It's nothing that you put into your body that defiles. It's kind of a gross analogy. It's what comes out of your body that's gross and defiles. Well, that attacks and destroys the entire kosher diet law from the Torah. All those dietary restrictions are thrown out the window by Jesus. Jesus does the same thing with the Sabbath. The Sabbath is made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Jesus declares that an uncircumcised centurion has more faith than any Jew of the time. Now, these are extraordinary anti-Torah statements, but scholars now recognize that it was the later figure, Paul, who did not know Jesus and who lived after any historical Jesus, who was probably the creator of this Torah criticism. His letter to the Galatians shows that Paul was in fierce debate with all of the Christian leadership before his time on just these issues: circumcision, kosher diet, that sort of adherence to the law, and what the effect of Jesus' crucifixion had on that. And so we realize now that the statements that the Jesus Seminar, for example, thought were the most credible to go back to Jesus, that 10 or 15% they said, are in fact the most anti-Torah, pro-Roman material, and therefore post-Paul. Paul would not have had such a fierce argument over these issues with all the previous Christians and Christian leadership had Jesus actually said those things that the Gospels quote him as having said. Paul never quotes Jesus, although it would have been quite helpful in his arguments about Torah changes in the Torah and so forth. More than that, Paul insists that all this stuff comes from his own revelation of Jesus Christ, and he learned it from no man, he specifically says. So scholars, at least most scholars now, recognize that the anti-Torah stuff that Jesus is quoted as saying, which the Jesus Seminar happened to think was the 10 or 15% that was most accurate, is really a post-Paul creation that was retroactively put into the mouth of Jesus to give Paul's side of the argument the authority of Jesus. That's the way most scholars now look at it, that the early Christians, including Jesus himself, must have been Torah orthodox. Let me further suggest that if there was a historical Jesus, he was crucified by the Romans, and that means that he was perceived as a violent, nationalist, militant, rebel, messianic figure. The first century was filled with such figures, rebel figures, who were Torah orthodox, militant nationalists. And Jesus, of course, is just the opposite. The New Testament, when you look at it from the 30,000-foot perspective, is in fact, and you put it into its historical context, these two great Jewish wars of the first and second centuries, which were religiously motivated, in fact, motivated by the messianic prophecies of the Jews. They were militant, nationalist, sectarian, Torah orthodox. In effect, they were the opposite of our New Testament Christians. The New Testament, written in Greek, clearly represents a critical reaction to the Jewish rebels of the first two Jewish wars. These cataclysmic Jewish wars are the historical context here that must be borne in mind. The Jews fought a tremendous war with the Romans in the first century. It was the war that reduced the temple to the Wailing Wall that it is today. There may have been hundreds of thousands of casualties, tens of thousands of Jews brought into slavery at this time. It was a psychologically and religiously traumatic event for Jews. Pagans and Jews both recognized that it was the messianic prophecies of the Jews which had most motivated this war. And so what we see in Christianity, according to my thesis, is a critical response to the Jewish rebels of the time. It not only has the theological agendas, which most critical scholars acknowledge, it also has a political agenda, clear political agenda. Paul 13 commands obedience to the Roman state as if they are God's, declaring them to be God's agents on earth. Rebellion is not just a bad idea, it's a sin. Not paying your taxes is not just a good practical idea of getting along with the Roman Empire. It's a sin to not pay your taxes because the Roman state are God's agents on earth. Whew. Well, Jesus says similar things. He declares of a Roman centurion that he, not just a Roman, but a Roman centurion in this age of rebellion, has more faith than any Jew he knows, period. End of report. This uncircumcised Jew, this uncircumcised Roman soldier, not just a Roman, but a Roman centurion, has more faith. Now, if you look at it, the New Testament is riddled with Roman fingerprints and Roman propaganda. I was having a discussion with Bart Ehrman earlier this year, the very famous critical biblical scholar who just conceded flat out that the passion narrative, the story of Jesus' trial and execution, is pure fiction, and that the structure that all four gospels share is basically a parable, an allegory, fictional allegory, designed to exonerate the Romans for the execution of Jesus and to blame the Jews. Let's face it, Christian anti-Semitism over the last 2,000 years has been a direct product of the stories of the New Testament, which squarely blame the Jewish people collectively for the death of Jesus. When they would do passion play performances during the Middle Ages, that would routinely cause mob violence against local Jews who are clearly blamed. In Matthew's version of the Passion, he has the Jewish crowd who's demanding Jesus' death 3 times before Pilate, who declared Jesus innocent in all 4 Gospels, flat out innocent, says, let's not do this. And the crowd insists on a Jewish crowd insists on Jesus' death 3 times violently before Pilate finally, not wanting a rebellion on his hands, says, "Okay, let's crucify Jesus." But he melodramatically, like a political cartoon, washes his hands of it. And in Matthew's version, the crowd even collectively says, apparently in unison, "His blood is on us and on our children." Well, we don't even need that when you understand the whole passion narrative: the betrayal of Judas, the denial of Peter, the conviction of violating the Mosaic law by the Sanhedrin, Pilate's declaration of his innocence, and so forth and so on. It's quite plain that it's political, that the structure of the passion narrative in all 4 Gospels is political, fictional parable. We know it's fiction because had the Sanhedrin wanted someone executed, they would have had them stoned, as we know they had the power to do, and as historians tell us they did routinely. They would have had, like James, the brother of Jesus, according to Josephus, is stoned. So, had the Jews ever been involved in this, it would have been a stoning, not a crucifixion. Um, this leads me to be strongly a historicist. I think there was a historical Jesus, but I think he was a violent militant rebel, exactly the opposite of the guy who's presented in the Gospels.
So explain more about that. Tell me that you're a historicist because why? What is it that tells you that there was a Jesus, and it's not just full mythicism?
Well, the mythicists, when I first became an atheist, many as a teenager, many, many years ago, uh, I figured there must have been a historical guy named Jesus. And they, crucified by Pilate, and they just exaggerated the stories about him over time. And they added to him like decorating a Christmas tree or something over time. And the fact that the Gospels are so heavily mythologized does at least leave open credence to the idea that Jesus may have been a total myth. On the other hand, if we press the matter further, the earliest Christians were having a hard time with Jesus' crucifixion. Paul is perfectly vague about the powers of this age that were responsible for the execution of Jesus. He doesn't want to name them at all. And in the Gospels, as I say, they have to create this elaborate fiction to explain why the Jews are responsible for a Roman execution. If they'd invented it from scratch and wanted to blame the Jews, they could have invented a stoning. So it seems the fact of crucifixion is a historical fact that the earliest Christians, Paul and the gospel writers, are having a hard time coping with. That's the primary fact that, apart from the fact that, who would make up a particular execution in the governorship of Pilate by a guy named Jesus? There's no real explanation for a dude named Jesus crucified at that very time. And so I think that bare fact is very probably historical. And the fact that Christians are having a difficult time wrestling with this crucifixion and trying to turn it on its head and fictionalize it shows that they really can't get around what is apparently a historical fact.
And how much do you think is invented by the Romans versus what actually happened? Where is the cutoff point?
Well, all we have to do is look to the giant elbow in Judaism that Christianity represents. In recent times, I would say in an increasing movement over the last 2 or 3 centuries that has reached a climax in our time, there have been attempts to show Christianity as an emanation, an organic development, a natural development from Judaism. But no, when we actually look at the history of it, at its origins, in its original text, in its original practice, Christianity represents a radical break with everything Jewish before. All the distinctively Jewish elements of the Torah are thrown out the window. Circumcision is no longer necessary, says Paul. He argues it extensively. Jesus praises the faith of the Roman centurion, higher, presumably uncircumcised, higher than that of any Jew. Kosher diet gets thrown out the window by Jesus and Paul. Strict Sabbath observance gets thrown out the window by Jesus. Jesus commands us, even if just symbolically, to do that most Torah anathema of things: drink blood. Nothing could be more offensive to Torah sensibilities than the drinking of blood, and Jesus commands it. Jesus is a man God, wholly unprecedented in Judaism, which is monotheistic. It has angels and demons and angelic powers, but there's only one God. And to assert, as the New Testament repeatedly appears to, that Jesus is God is just not Judaism. Jesus himself admits that he's changing the law. You have heard it said, thou shalt not kill. But I tell you, if you feel anger in your heart, you've already sinned. You've heard it said, thou shalt not commit adultery. But I tell you, if you feel lust in your heart, you've already sinned. Whoa. He even admits he's modifying the law, which makes his later statement, don't think that I've come to change the law, but to fulfill it, rather an overcompensation. Okay? Why would anyone think that, Jesus, since you're totally modifying everything distinctive about Judaism? Christianity represents a sharp elbow. Nothing anticipated in previous Hebrew scripture suggests that there will be a God man whose blood you'll drink. Quite the opposite. This is much more akin to a pagan mystery cult god of the Greeks or the Romans or the Egyptians of the time, a suffering savior god, typically presented as having a horrible execution, but enjoys an apotheosis afterwards, providing the cult members a hope in their own immortal soul and a better afterlife. This pattern was centuries older than Christianity and simply absorbed by Christianity, but a distinctly un-Jewish element of it. That's just the anti-Jewish element. Anti-Semitism, as I say, is built in to the Gospels, which are increasingly anti-Semitic as they develop.
Well, just to jump in there, so my initial thought is that as religions change, obviously I'm also an atheist, so I don't believe any religions are actually true. As we have new incarnations or interpretations of religions, it seems like there are always changes that are representative of the culture that they are in. So, like today, we're seeing progressive Christianity, where Christians are more open to LGBT rights, which is clearly completely against the doctrine of
Ignore a good
Christianity.
Bible.
But I don't think that was invented by the Romans either. So I mean, clearly,
No, no,
so I
you're
think that there's an argument there that the changes that could have happened, even if Jesus was a real person, he could have advocated for these changes because it was more in line with the cultural identity of the time. And I think that that's something that's very common among religions, to have changes that reflect the common culture. And so I don't think it was necessarily invented by the Romans to expect to see these kinds of things.
That's only step one of the case here. But you're absolutely correct. Such changes happen all the time. In fact, we see pro-Roman Jews like Philo dramatically Hellenizing Judaism all on its own. Without, I mean, they're pro-Roman in their politics, but they're not going the full Roman way that the New Testament is. Furthermore,
Just to interrupt, Brute Facts podcast, Eddie is a friend of mine. He asked if you want to debate this sometime. So if you want to,
let's
cool. Send him your email, or have
I'm
Jeff
happy
send
to
him your email.
this topic. No, the reason why I say this is that it's not simply such as the heavy Hellenized, you know, Philo was this first century Jew who combined Judaism with Greek philosophy, Stoicism and Platonism, and he tried to integrate the two. And that's the sort of natural, organic development one can see going on in Judaism. What we see immediately after the First Jewish War, however, is a paradoxical combination of things. The most radical elements of the Jewish rebel nationalists being combined, says these people resist Greco-Roman culture. These would be the last people who would adopt a God man and a Torah critical position. And yet it is that messianic idea and prophecies which are being turned on their head, upside down, and forced into this. So we see a paradoxical fusing of the rebels' own ideology with this radically Hellenized view. Now, that's just the first step, because I have a lot more evidence that connects Rome. The Roman fingerprints are all over this thing. As I say, Paul explicitly commands obedience to the Roman government, not just obedience, but as God's agents on earth. Rebellion is not just a bad idea, it's a sin. Paying your taxes is not just a good idea to get along and go along. It's a sin not to pay your taxes to the Roman government. Slaves, obey your masters. It's repeatedly stated in the New Testament. Jesus behaves as a slave. He converts the entire 90% of Jews, more than 90%. The widespread expectation of Jews was that their Messiah would be a man, an earthly man, maybe with miraculous powers like Moses or Joshua from the Old Testament, but he would be a human being who would lead the Jews to an earthly conquest, earthly political victory. He would be a military political guy who would kick the Romans' butts here on earth and give the Jews their independent state again. Jesus turns that whole conception of Messiah upside down. My kingdom is not of this earth. says Jesus. And you disciples, you've got it all wrong. In the kingdom of heaven, the last shall be first and the first shall be last. And so let me just act, me, the Messiah, the King of the Jews, let me get on my knees and behave as a slave and wash the feet of y'all. Jesus is,
Well, just at that point, I also seem to be doesn't seem to be like it must have been invented by the Romans, because if there was somebody who thought they were the Messiah and they didn't have any military power, obviously they can't. The Jews were expecting somebody to come with a sword and like conquer the Romans and take over, and clearly Jesus wasn't going to do that, so he had to make up some excuse, right? Why aren't you like militarily taking over? It's like, oh, it's because I'm not here to do that, right? So
well,
that's justifiably also like something he could have just made up.
there's real no, well, but the point is that Jesus is advocating, well, there's all kinds of other things. When has his famous prophecy about the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, which is of course a post-event prophecy, like most accurate prophecies from religionists, they're written after the event to put back into the past an "I told you so" prophet. And this is true of Mark 13. When Jesus comes into Jerusalem and predicts the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple by the Romans, he makes this prediction as a dire warning against rebellion. In fact, many of the statements of Jesus cannot be understood except in the rebel context. Whoever picks up the sword shall die by the sword. Well, lots of people who pick up swords die of natural causes. So it's an absurd statement on its face. But in the context of the Jewish war, it makes perfect sense. You see, whoever fights against the Romans are going to get their butts kicked. And again, the whole prediction of the fall of Jerusalem is a dire warning to the rebels not to rebel. Jesus goes into the temple, which the Romans are about to destroy, morally justifies the Roman destruction to come. You've turned it into a den of thieves instead of a house of prayer for all nations, which is exactly what the rebels would not say. He actually physically commences the destruction of the temple, the attack on the temple that the Romans would complete. As I say, obviously the death stories of Jesus are a political parable, a political fiction designed to exonerate the Roman state and inculpate the Jews. The theme implicit in the New Testament Gospels is that the Jews were punished, got their punishment in the Jewish war, and lost precisely because they misunderstood the concept of Messiah and killed their own Messiah because of it. And the Jews got their comeuppance for it. That is how all early Christians look at it. It's really even hard to not see that in the Gospels themselves. So not only do we have political parable fiction, which is pro-Roman and anti-Jewish at this time of Jewish-Roman conflict, but we have Jesus saying wild things like not just a Roman, but a Roman centurion in this age of rebellion has more faith than any Jew. It's extraordinary. So when you put all these things sort of together, it becomes clear that all the way down to whoever picks up the sword line, Jesus is criticizing the Jewish rebels of his own time. If we don't put it into that context, all of these things become utterly inexplicable. The Romans are the ones who fulfilled Jesus' prophecy. Jesus further has a remarkable prophecy that says that there'll be a glorious coming of the Son of Man when the temple is destroyed and Jerusalem is destroyed, right then and there within the lifetime of people who are listening to him. Well, the only people that can apply to are the Roman emperors Vespasian and Titus, who, as we know from both pagan and Jewish sources, claimed to be the actual Jewish messiahs. These uncircumcised Roman conquerors are, in fact, the Jewish Messiah, according to the Jew Josephus, Yohanan ben Zakkai, the father of the rabbinic movement at Yavne, as well as pagan historians like Suetonius and Tacitus. It was an important part of these Roman emperors' propaganda to claim that they were, in fact, the Jewish messiahs. So Jewish religion was being used actively by the Roman government in their propaganda in the first century. We know this. And we know that Josephus was hired, a Jew was hired as the official propagandist of these Flavian emperors. There were elite Jews high up working with the emperor who would have found Christianity very, very amenable to their needs. More than that, Christianity represented a way to redirect, if you will, the rebels in their ideological cause for the war. It turns Messianic Judaism into a pro-Roman, pro-peace, anti-nationalist thing. Christianity goes down a checklist of everything the Romans objected to in Judaism. Check, 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 and changes it to conform with Greco-Roman culture. Christians obviously assimilated into the Roman Empire a whole lot easier than Jews did. depending on how extreme the kind of Christianity it was. Remember, before the 4th century, there were a variety of Christianities. Uh, uh, Nearly all of them, if we call them Christianities, are extremely pro-Roman in their politics. They have just as much an obvious political agenda as they do a theological agenda, a pro-Roman one, even if they have to fictionalize the accounts of Jesus' death. Jesus befriends tax collectors. Jesus says the very thing the Jewish rebels say is impossible. You can't be a good Roman citizen and a good Jew who worships God. Jesus says, no, give back to God what's God's and give to Caesar's what's Caesar's. You can do both consistently, which is a direct answer to the rebels. We can both be worshipers of the Jewish God and do service, respectful service to Caesar. You see, even the coin Jesus touches in that story is a graven image in violation of Jewish law. Jesus touches this polluted image just to make the point that Jewish purity laws are out the window and we can touch Roman money even if it's got a God's face on it, which is like idol worship to the Jews. You go to the temple and buy your sacrifices. You have to exchange this pagan money for temple money because this pagan money will have all these graven images, which are a violation of the big 10 commandments of the Torah. So it's plain to me that what we have here are Roman fingerprints all over it. Jesus befriends tax collectors. Jesus praises a centurion. The Passion narrative is clearly political allegory. Even the famous Bart Ehrman admits that it's pro-Roman political fiction in all 4 Gospels. When you have overt, like I say, Paul goes way overboard when it comes to just getting along with the Romans. No, the Romans are God's agents on earth. That's why we obey them. And justification for what the Romans did, the destruction of the temple and so forth, and showing that it's no longer necessary is a central feature of New Testament literature.
So, well, we had a question for the audience before I go on. It's how do you account for the Essene aesthetic pacifists in the unilateral depiction of the Jews?
Well, Josephus, being a Roman propagandist who wants to...
And could you explain what that means?
Oh, okay, yeah. Okay. In the 1st century, we're told by Jewish writers like Philo and Josephus of the main divisions of Jews at the time. And what are basically described are 3 main divisions: Sadducees, who are in control of the temple; Pharisees, who are concerned about Jewish law, we're told, although that's an interesting question; and then these Essenes, these Essenes, sometimes the guys who probably were part of the movement that wrote what we call the sectarian documents of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And these are radicals who thought that the established Jewish practice was not good enough. And so they went out, quote, into the wilderness to establish their more pure practices. Now, some of these were not consistent with traditional Judaism, such as celibacy, right? God commands that be fruitful and multiply, get married. The Essenes, at least some of them were celibate. The Essenes held their property in common. Again, very similar to Christianity. We're told in the New Testament, the disciples held their property in common. There are a lot of connections between Essenes and Christians. They have a leadership organization of 12 and so forth. Unfortunately, these Essenes are extremely Torah orthodox. Now, we're told they're pacifists by Josephus, who is, I think, trying to whitewash them. Elsewhere, Josephus says that the Essenes at the time of the Jewish war could not be tortured into calling another man Lord. Well, if these Essenes are pacifists, why are Romans torturing them? More than that, we found fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls in Masada. So the militant rebels who were holding out to the last minute there in 73 at Masada, who committed mass suicide, according to the story of Josephus, were Dead Sea Scrolls type sectarians, Essenes. We have other writers who are a little more honest than Josephus, who admit that there was an entire sect of Essenes who were, in fact, militant Essenes, who appear to be the leaders of the Jewish revolt. These so-called peace-loving Essenes, I do not believe were advocating things like paying your Roman taxes, nor were they introducing blood drinking. It would be Torah anathema to them. Nor were they saying circumcision and kosher diet nor were they saying things like Rome are God's agents on earth. We have no evidence that the Essenes went even 10% as far as the Christians did in declaring God to have gone over to the Roman side, or in their sweeping denunciation of everything distinctive in the Torah. No Essene is said to have done that. That we
Well,
find uniquely in Christianity. There's
well, I
nothing
think there's an argument there that
narrative.
well, I think there's an argument there that's like natural selection versus design. It's or a parallel to that argument. So it's possible that there are many different variations of interpretations of Christianity at the time, and the one that isn't, the one that's naturally selected by the others being killed off is the one that's going to be successful. And so, because the Jesus narrative was most in line with the Romans, they didn't have to invent it; they just killed off all the other ones.
No,
Therefore,
for it to be Jesus's narrative, that's fiction. It was Paul's narrative that criticized the law and said the Romans are God's agents on earth. The Gospels were written after Paul's letters. That too is now a scholarly consensus. Paul is almost entirely ignorant of the contents of the Gospels, and the Gospels appear to be justifying Paul's theology. So it's now universally, almost universally accepted by scholars that Paul's letters came
well,
first, and
just
that
to classify all of those into one, just sort of call it Jesus' narrative, just as a title. But
right,
the point seems to be, and this is a question I had too, was that it seems like it's possible that this didn't need to be invented by the Romans, more that the Romans could just latch onto it because there's probably going to be lots of versions of Christianity, like there always are,
well,
and they're going to pick one that's most conducive to their ideology. And
there's
so,
no evidence, there's
why
no
would this need to be invented? And because there is clearly lots of different changes to the Jewish culture in many different directions, such as these guys.
Yeah, I'll continue with the evidence for this that makes it conclusive. I mean, Paul refers to high connections in Caesar's household that he has. Paul refers to famous people who are probably Roman imperials and high ranking government officials in the state. Paul refers to his access to the entire Praetorian Guard. In the book of Acts, Roman officials are constantly protecting Paul from Jewish attacks. Again and again and again and again, we see uh, uh, it could be even, some scholars have argued that Paul is related to the Herodians, the pro Roman client kings of the Jews. There's significant evidence, at least to that effect, and Professor Eisenman has, I think, made some good arguments in that regard. It's a bit controversial, but there's little doubt in Paul's authentic letters, which are the oldest material in the New Testament. Take the letter to the Philippians. He says, he has contacts with a bunch of people in Caesar's household in Rome. He says he has such access to the Praetorian Guard that they've all heard the message. In that very same letter, he refers to an Epaphroditus, who we know was a leading Roman minister of state from Nero to Domitian, probably Jewish and probably the patron of the Jew Josephus, who dedicates his works to him. So what we really have here are all kinds of Roman fingerprints and connections between Paul and high-ranking Roman officials. This is only further confirmed by the tradition in the book of Acts. Paul is apparently buddy-buddy with a consular-ranked Roman senator named Sergius Paulus, from whom he apparently gets his name Paul. It's from a Roman aristocrat who is a consular-ranked governor of Cyprus who's helping Paul out, no less. The Romans, according to the book of Acts, send an entire cohort of their army to go protect Paul, which makes perfect sense. If you're advocating what Paul does, the Romans aren't going to persecute him. They're going to give him a soapbox. And this is true generally. I mean, Jesus would not have been crucified had he said anything like that pro-peace stuff or anti-Torah stuff that the Gospels quote him. The Romans would have given him a soapbox. Well, the Jews, even before that, would have stoned him to death. Scholars have conclusively shown that most of the sayings of Jesus, the theoretical, hypothetical Q document, was composed originally in Greek. Jesus could not have said any of that stuff because the language appears to have been originally written in Greek, and an itinerant preacher in Galilee would, of course, been preaching to the ordinary people, would be preaching Aramaic. But we have political connections. More than that, our earliest physical evidence of Christianity are the catacombs of Rome. The earliest of these catacombs is the tomb of Saint Domitilla, the granddaughter of the Roman Emperor Vespasian. Her husband was a cousin of the emperors Titus and Domitian, and he was executed for, quote, adopting Jewish ways. In my view, he is likely to be Saint Clement of Rome. The reference there, I think, is an oblique reference to the fact that he was a Christian. And we do have a Saint Clement of Rome from this period. His wife, her catacomb, is identified as both a Flavian site and a Christian site by the use of the same symbols. It's also inscribed as the Flavian sepulchre. So the Flavian emperor's tomb, at least for a large number of the family members, is the earliest physical evidence we have of Christianity. Imperial symbols used by the Flavians, who claim to be the Jewish messiahs, are the earliest symbols used for Jesus. They're, of course, graven images, so they're throwing the Ten Commandments out the window early on by symbolically representing the divine. But the symbols of the Flavians were more commonly used on the cross in the first 3 centuries of Christianity: anchors and fish. People are aware of the fish, for example, but the fish is a thoroughly, graven image, and that kind of symbolism began with Roman emperors, the Flavians, and we first see it in the earliest physical evidence of Christianity, which is the tomb of a Roman imperial lady, Domitilla. We're told, moreover, by Pliny the Younger, in the first real pagan reference to Christianity, that Christianity had reached its peak in the Flavian era, about 20 years before his writing, and that it involved all classes of Romans. For this to be the case, it would have to be the kind of Christian, Torah critical, anti nationalist, internationalist perspective that the Romans had. See, you look at Roman coins, for example, T-Jump. You know what you see in Roman coins on the first century? Peace on earth, goodwill toward men. Boom, boom, boom. Mercy, compassion. Boom. Hope, spes, eternus. Boom. Concepts that are all over the New Testament are, in fact, common moral precepts that are part of Roman propaganda that you find on Roman coinage in the first centuries. Mercy, concordia, harmonia, getting along with people, a pax orbis terrarum, peace on earth. So when Jesus' birth in Luke is hailed as bringing peace on earth, goodwill toward men, they're simply quoting Roman propaganda from the coins jingling in your pockets right now. There's no one in the first 2 centuries who could possibly have missed either the Flavian connections, because there's all kinds of allegorical connections between the story of Jesus and the Roman emperors, the Flavian emperors, who claimed to be the Jewish messiahs, and this glorious Son of Man fulfillment of Jesus' own prophecy could really have only applied to them. In my view, Mark 13 and their repetitions in Matthew and Luke are simply justifications for the Flavian emperor's claim to be emperor.
Could you? What was the year that was written on the coins?
Oh, you'll find clementia, mercy, compassion on coins as early as the first century BC. You'll find pax orbis terrarum, all the way, things like that, pax and pax orbis terrarum, all the way through the first century. And they become extremely popular during the Flavian era in particular. The Flavians built a temple to peace, and they even put that temple on some of their coins. And they really emphasized and stressed that they brought peace by defeating the Jews and ending a civil war in Rome. And so bringing peace and being princes of peace was a big part of their propaganda. Being of humble origin was a big part of Flavian propaganda.
Do we have any coins that are older than Jesus that say that?
Oh yeah, older than Jesus that talk about peace. Well, the temple to peace was built by Vespasian and after the civil wars and stuff. But the praise of peace on Roman coins way predates that.
Well, specifically the peace on earth one.
Yes, Pax Orbis Terrarum predates the Flavians, absolutely. And in fact, the Pax Augusta or the Pax Romana is a significant part of Roman propaganda going back to before Jesus' birth. But it really reaches its fever pitch at around the time Jesus is said to have been born at the turn of the Common Era. Augustus is really pumping out those, the Pax Romana, I brought peace to the world coins. In fact, the deification of Augustus is very much like the deification of Jesus in some ways. When you read the inscriptions on how Roman emperors are being deified, they bring the gospel, the evangelon, the good news, the good tidings of the world savior, Soter, who brings world peace. And so the very language, the Son of God, who bring the Savior, who brings world peace, and it's the good news that we're bringing to the world. You can find these inscriptions that are Roman government propaganda inscriptions all over the Roman world. The Romans would not try and stamp out local religions. One of the reasons why the Romans were so long lasting is that they had a very flexible and liberal, in the time, Obviously, you had censorship and official religion and all that. They could ban religions and so forth. But for the ancient world, the Romans tried to allow foreigners to have their religion. They tried, in fact, to absorb their religions as much as possible. The Romans were famous for absorbing Greek religion, Egyptian religion, Phrygian religion, even Parthian gods like Mithras were being brought, who were their enemies, were being brought in. If there was no Roman form of Judaism, it would be a gap. It would be a lacuna. And so Christianity, I think, is the one thing that can fill that gap. Where is the Roman form of Judaism? There's a Roman form of every other Eastern religion. The Romans, that's what Romans do. So, like, just as we see in Virgil's Aeneid, a use of Greek religion to help Roman propaganda and prop up the Julian emperors, who are said to be descended from Aeneas, the hero of the Aeneid, Greek religion is being commandeered for Roman religious political propaganda. Similarly, the New Testament, like the Aeneid, is using a foreign religion, just as Virgil did in the Aeneas, to prop up a new dynasty, the Flavians, at least initially. And to do that, they had to create this prophet, Jesus, who pre-existed them, who predicted the coming of the new Roman messiahs, which Jesus perfectly accurately predicted. But that creates a previous free-floating Jewish prophet named Jesus, who could long outlive the Flavians. And that's what happened. They created a highly Hellenized man god, much more predicated. See, it's the Jewish rebels, it's the Messianic Jews who would have found this anathema, who would have been most unlikely to have adopted a Jewish or a pagan man god in any way. They were resisting polytheism, they were resisting Greco-Roman influence. When we see the Messianic rebellion philosophy being commandeered, turned on its head, and filled with all this peace propaganda and pagan man god ideas, then we're looking at something paradoxical. What can explain the rebel ideas being turned immediately into pro-Roman, Greco-Roman assimilation ideas? But as I say, we have all kinds of other circumstantial evidence. Paul claims to have connections in Caesar's household. He claims to have total access to the imperial guard of the emperor in Rome. He claims to know people who appear to be high-ranking imperials in the Roman court. Um, uh, I see no other rational way of looking at those things either. Moreover, the physical evidence, the earliest physical evidence of Christianity we possess, shows that it's high-ranking imperial Romans tomb that is the earliest catacomb in Rome. We see on the Flavian's coinage, on the Flavian coinage, the earliest symbols used in the Christian catacombs to depict Jesus and Christians, anchors and fish. And that uniquely appears on the coins of the Flavians, briefly under Hadrian at the time of the Second Rebellion. So the symbol appears to be only used by Romans when they're gearing up this it seems to me clearly, not only is it a critical response to the Jewish rebels, but it's a way they have of reconditioning the tens of thousands of Messianic Jews who must have just been enslaved. We keep hearing slaves obey your masters, slaves obey your masters, obey the Roman state, pay your taxes, render unto Caesar. Jesus befriends tax collectors. Jesus befriends a centurion's faith as being not just a Roman, but a Roman soldier's faith as being higher than that of any Jew of the time, higher than that of any Jew of the time. It is his own disciples who deny him and betray him. It is the Jewish Sanhedrin that convicts him of violating Mosaic law. Pilate declares him innocent. And that's all obviously political fiction. When you put all of the evidence together, it makes a much stronger case than it seems to me than most of the technical cases that many scholars debate about, Matthean priority over Lucan priority or something. Those are, or historicism even, versus mythicism. Those pale in comparison to the kind of evidence that we have in front of us and has been sitting under our noses for the last 2,000 years, that New Testament Christianity represents a critical response, a critical Roman response to the Jewish rebels with whom they were contending at the time. Scholars have basically come to the point that it was just before or just between the two great Jewish wars that just about all of the New Testament was composed.
Gotcha. We did have another question from Marty Mad Scientist. When do you think the Christianity transitioned to a real honest religion rather than an intentional construct?
I think that, Dominic Crossan, the famous Bible scholar, once said something very, very wise here. He said, "It's not that we're so wise as to see allegory in something that was first considered uh, fact. No, we're insisting on seeing fact in something that was originally written as allegory." The Gospels themselves, as allegorical truth, as moral truth, I think were believed, and this distinguishes me from other scholars who believe in Roman providence. For example, Joseph Atwill, with whom I have a number of significant disagreements. He's a mythicist, for example, and he says a lot of other things that I disagree with. And he thinks that the Gospels, in effect, are all giant Roman joke on the Jews at the time. And one could look at it that way, I suppose. But I happen to read sincere moral philosophy. I happen to read some beautiful poetry there. I don't really agree with the religion of Christianity in its substance, but I still believe that the authors could have been very sincere, at least in believing the allegorical truth of what they were saying, both morally and politically. Back in those days, there was no separation like we have today of church and state. That's really something that only the last 250 years have seen since the advent of America, the first real secular government in history. But 2,000 years ago, every political event had religious significance and required religious explanation. Every religious event had to be tied to the reality on the ground. And so, take Egypt, the connection between the pharaohs and the flooding of the Nile was a metaphysical implication to them. Having the good order of the world is a metaphysical. Whoever wins in battle obviously had God's favor, etc., etc., etc. The Roman Republic regarded itself as a sacred institution favored by the gods, and look at the success of the Rome. Obviously, the Romans are on God. The gods are on the Roman side. The Romans have been so successful, and so if you are a faithful Jew in the late first century and you face the cataclysm of the defeat at Roman hands and the destruction of your temple, you're going to need an explanation for the destruction of that temple. And the New Testament is obsessed with just that fact, justifying, explaining, and telling us why we no longer need this temple that the Romans just destroyed.
Gotcha. All right. So could you tell us more about the historical context of the Romans? Because you said all this was Roman propaganda, but you didn't explain what was going on and the dynamics between the relationship of the Romans and the Jews at the time, of why they would want to put this out as propaganda.
Well, they need to. They can't really stamp out the Jewish religion or their messianic prophecies. The best they can do, they
Well,
know they
start with
need.
the time period. What time period are you hypothesizing that these changes occurred in, and what was going on then?
To give the even broader context, in the 2nd century BC, the Jewish people rebelled from their Syrian Greek overlords in the famous Hanukkah revolt of the Maccabees and set up the last independent Jewish state that existed before the 20th century came up with Israel. And it was taken over by the Romans in the 1st century BC. Now, the Romans try very hard to let the Jews do their own thing and enforce their own Mosaic law and respect their religion, keep their temple. This is in line with typical Roman policy. They are very reluctant to force religions on people or to destroy their temples. The Romans do not do that. They are religiously accommodating, as I say. And so they gave certain exemptions for the Jews in the practice of worshiping state Roman gods, for example. However, this was not sufficient. In the 1st century, around 6 AD, we're told that the Romans impose a census to begin to impose taxes in the region. It's mentioned in the Nativity story in Luke, for example. Joseph and Mary come for that census to Bethlehem. But it was at this time, Josephus tells us, that the rebellion broke out. A fellow by the name of Judas the Galilean invented what Josephus derogatorily calls a fourth philosophy, which is probably ultra-conservative Judaism, far from being a radical innovation, because he's a rebel who wants to kick out the Romans and go back to our old Jewish ways. That tax rebellion, ultra-conservative religious tax rebellion, fails. But from that time forward, throughout the 1st century, we have violent disturbances all over the Roman Empire between religious Jews and Greeks and Romans. We have it in Alexandria and Egypt, and a delegation has to be sent to Caligula around 40 AD to settle the matter. There's disturbances of violent Messianic Jews in Rome in the 40s, causing the Emperor Claudius to expel all the Jews from Rome for such violent disturbances. There's arson in the city of Antioch blamed on Jewish rebels. So whether it's Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, we have an empire-wide problem that requires an ideological response. And as I indicated, the Romans were experts at ideological counter-propaganda that involved religion. They used Greek religion, Egyptian religion, and their own political propaganda to get those people to be absorbed and assimilated into the Roman Empire. Christianity represents precisely that. It's an effort to absorb and redirect the messianic religion that was causing such violent problems to the Romans. 10 to 15% of the population of the entire Roman Empire was Jewish. I mean, think about it today, only 2-3% of our population are Jewish in America. Only 12-13% are African Americans. 10 to 15% of the entire population, Rome, Alexandria, the Greek area, all the way to Syria, are Jews. They need an empire-wide ideological response, the sort of ideological response they're used to mounting. If we don't have something like Christianity, I would be very much surprised. It takes an extremely pro-Roman perspective and an extremely anti-rebel perspective while commandeering the very ideas of those rebels. A paradoxical move that I think cannot otherwise be explained.
Can you talk more about, you said there were examples of Romans doing this before with the Greeks and the Egyptians. Can you talk about the history of when and how Romans have done this before and used propaganda in order to inculcate a group of people into the community?
Well, very famously, by the 2nd century BC, the Romans had pretty fully adopted the Greek pantheon of gods and identified them with their own gods. By the 1st century BC, you could worship
Well, were
Egyptian.
they using the same kind of propaganda here that's what I'm looking for, like
Yeah,
connections between that propaganda?
only step one, how their awareness of and the infiltration of these foreign cults. But I'll give you all manner of sorts of examples here. It's not just the Greeks; it's the Egyptians. It's you name it. If we are we'll give you a great example. Serapis is a god who was created by the Ptolemaic Egyptians, a fusion of Osiris, who was a bodily resurrected. He's an Egyptian god of the afterlife. He was torn apart by his enemy, and his wife Isis puts his body back together to resurrect it. And he's the god of the underworld. So about 300 BC, Ptolemy the first Greek pharaoh of Egypt, fuses this Osiris Egyptian god with Greek gods like Hades and Asclepius, the healing god. And they're fused into a new god called Serapis. And this cultural fusion god, Serapis, serves as a model for the Romans in their cultural fusion gods, which I believe Jesus to represent. Now, this isn't just a theory. Roman emperors called themselves the new Serapis. Vespasian himself will have coins with his face on one side and the face of the god Serapis on the other. So does Titus. They're claiming to be the new Serapis to Egyptians. So here they are commandeering Egyptian religion and using it in their own Roman propaganda on their own coins. Egyptian religion is directly, this goes back to Julius Caesar. When Julius Caesar married Cleopatra in the 1st century BC, he was declared a Roman god, Egyptian god, and an Egyptian king. This was true when Cleopatra then married Mark Antony, who was declared to be an Egyptian god and an Egyptian king. So the Romans, as early as the 1st century BC, are calling themselves the god pharaohs of Egypt, in effect, just as they're absorbing Greek religion and saying we're the descendants of these heroes from Homer, this Greek myth story. And that's what Virgil's Aeneid is all about. On Augustus's coins, you'll see images to distinctively Greek gods. You'll see all kinds of other imagery where the Romans are themselves absorbing. I mean, the Emperor Nero was given a diadem and worshipped as the Parthian god, or a version at least, of the Parthian god Mithra. That's Nero in the middle of the 1st century before the Jewish War. So we have many, many, many examples of Romans using Egyptian, Greek, Parthian, Phrygian religion. As I say, it would be a gap, a lacuna, if we didn't see a pro-Roman version of Judaism. And to see a pro-Roman version of militant Messianic Judaism is particularly paradoxical.
So they've done this to pretty much every major religion that they've had conflict with. It's a very common thing Romans do.
Almost inevitable thing. If it's one of the older cultures from the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East, one of these ancient cultures the Romans had tremendous respect for, I cannot find a single example where they didn't do this. But you can also find it in Europe, side by side inscriptions done by wealthy and political Romans to the local gods that the Romans are doing. They're praising the local gods side by side with Roman state gods
Do,
all over
do,
the Roman Empire.
do you see examples of other ways the Romans have modified the Jewish religion that were not adopted? Do we have like historical evidence that the Romans did this in like if there was no other examples of Romans changing the religion, I think that'll be very strong evidence for your position, because that means that the ways they did change it must have been accepted, because they must, if they always do this, they must have added changes somewhere. And if we don't see any examples of changes, then that means they must have all been adopted by the religion, right? So are there any other examples that of things Romans did to try to modify Judaism which were not accepted by the Jewish culture?
Oh, everything. Just Jews to this day circumcise as a matter of mandatory. Nearly all Christians in Europe do not and have not for the last 2,000 years. Circumcision is simply not a religious requirement under Christianity. Most European Christians have never been circumcised, and yet is the very essence of the covenant with Abraham. Abraham says, circumcise all your male children. That's the symbol of the covenant with God. Out gets tossed the covenant's major symbol, circumcision. Kosher diet thrown out the window entirely. It's nothing you put in your body that defiles, says Jesus. You can eat anything you want, anything. Sacrificed to idols, unkosher, cheeseburgers, lobster, pork, you name it, you can eat it. And or strict Sabbath observance. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, etc. All the purity laws. Offending political sensibilities of contemporary Jews by befriending tax collectors and praising centurions, and so forth and so on. It is both political and religious. Jesus is on a systematic assault on Orthodox Judaism of his time, particularly Messianic Judaism, where he insists that their concept of Messiah as a real world political figure is all wrong. In the kingdom of heaven, the last shall be first and the first shall be last. So when the disciples say, who shall be the first? Jesus is saying, you guys got it all wrong. What you need to do is become a slave. Being a slave is your salvation opportunity. In one of the letters attributed to Paul, Paul even says it's a salvation opportunity to have a harsh master. Because, gosh, you're really getting credit on the other side in heaven. You'll really be on top on the other side. Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this earth. He's the king of the Jews, and he gets down on his feet and he acts like a slave and he washes the disciples' feet over and over and over, making the point that the rebels' conception of Messiah is incorrect. It's not a real earthly king, but an otherworldly king whose kingdom is not of this earth. That is, of course, Greek philosophy, Plato, all over the place. It's not Jewish ideas, however. Uh, and as I say, even that Hellenization of Judaism was found only in people like Philo, who were very much politically pro-Roman anyway. Among our rebels, which is where a lot of the ideas from Christianity are stolen and taken from, to find it in that context is utterly paradoxical, utterly paradoxical. And as I say, there's all kinds of other evidence from the text that the earliest writer of Christian material, Paul, was himself working with high-ranking Romans. There were high-ranking Jews at the time, as I say, many elite Jews who were obviously most Jews, probably joined the rebellion and were sympathetic with the rebellion. But there was a handful of very wealthy Jews who were working with the Romans and were trying to assimilate into Roman culture. These are the people who I suspect were behind the writing of the New Testament. Jews who wanted to get along with the Romans and redirect for political purposes the messianic philosophy that was causing the Jews such trouble. There'd be a second rebellion in the second century, which would cause the Jews to be expelled from Judea altogether. And there'd be no Jewish state until the 1940s when the state of Israel was created. Between that entire time, the Passion play performances in the Middle Ages, as I say, that recount the biblical story of Jesus' death, and it would typically cause mob violence against the local Jews. The Christianity claims to be built on Judaism, but it is an anti-Semitic religion that changes every distinctively Jewish feature of the religion, whether it's circumcision, kosher diet, Sabbath observance, the inhibition against graven images. From the start, Christians had no problem symbolizing God in crosses and anchors and fish, and making graven images left and right. The Protestants, very interestingly, in the 16th century, wanted to get back to basics and say, whatever happened to this rule about idols and graven images? So they stripped all those beautiful Catholic churches down to the bare minimum. So in Protestant Northern European churches, all you see is like a bare cross or something, if you see that, because all these statues and stained glass and candles and stuff. That's all anathema to Protestants who realized the problem here, you see. And so from that point forward, there's been an attempt by Christianity to re-Judaize what is an anti-Judaic philosophy in its origins. Now, I mean,
Awesome.
anti-Judaic only in one sense, that it's obviously directed at a very small portion of the Roman population. It was not at first aimed at converting all of the Roman Empire. No, it was aimed at a very specific targeted group. Those rebels who might be persuaded, although many of them probably might not be, the new ex-rebel slaves who we now have to tame if they're going to be good, docile slaves, and three, the high-ranking Jews who want to get along and go along and be assimilated. So it's serving Christianity is serving multiple cultural purposes for the Roman state that are just simply unmistakable.
Yeah, I think that's a strong argument. I think it makes a lot of sense to say that all of these changes don't make a lot of sense from the perspective of a Jewish Messiah, but they are all in line with the Roman goals at the time in order to make the Jewish people more conducive to the Roman society. So I think that's a strong argument that makes a lot of sense. But we have been going for about an hour. So
Time flies.
yeah. Do you want to give any links or references where people can find more about your work? And
Well, I'm very active on Facebook, and if anyone is on Facebook, we have a Roman Provenance of Christianity page on Facebook, and we have a Creating Christ page on Facebook. I myself am very active, and I'm happy to answer questions. I do so just about every day from critics of all kinds. I'm happy to field any question. But we also have a website, and that's probably the best place to get. We have visuals there where you can see this the earliest physical evidence of Christianity, which is clearly Roman, elite Roman stuff, and other links that we have there. And that's www.creatingchrist.com. Go check that out. And the real good news is we just heard from documentarians who've been working on a documentary on Creating Christ, a multi-part documentary on Creating Christ. They're putting the finishing touches in production, and they're now going into distribution contracts. So a multi-part documentary based on Creating Christ should be out in the next few months.
awesome. Thanks again for coming on. I really appreciate it. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
You too. Thank you very much.